Caroline Jessup stood in mud up to her ankles, holding a deed to 40 acres of land that was currently under 3 feet of brown water. The spring flood of 1892 had come and gone, leaving behind a wasteland of silt, debris, and the particular smell of river bottom that would take weeks to fade. This was her inheritance. This was what 2 years of marriage and 6 months of widowhood had earned her. Behind her, on the bluff road that stayed dry even in the worst floods, Horace Jessup sat on his wagon and watched her survey her new property. His voice carried easily across the flooded field. "The deed is registered proper, Caroline. 40 acres, bounded by the river on the west and the Hutchins claim on the east. Prime bottomland when it's dry. Shame about the flooding, but that's the river for you." Caroline didn't turn around. She was looking at the water line on the few trees that had survived the flood, calculating the height. 4 feet at least, maybe 5 in the deeper sections. Every spring, regular as taxes, this land drowned. "Thomas promised me the South 40, she said. Her voice was flat, emptied of the anger she couldn't afford to show. "The section by the creek with the good well." "Thomas promised a lot of things," Delphine said from her seat beside her husband. "But Thomas isn't here to honor them, is he? And the South 40 goes to family. Real family." Caroline finally turned. She looked at the 2 people who had made her life miserable since the day she married their son, who had blamed her for his death, even though she had been 3 miles away when he fell from the boat, who had spent 6 months finding ways to remind her that she had no claim on their sympathy or their property. "I am family. I was his wife." Horace shook his head with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering bad news he enjoys. "You were his wife. Now you're his widow, and widows get a portion. That's the law. This is your portion. 40 acres of good Missouri soil, free and clear. What you do with it is your business." He snapped the reins and the wagon rolled away, leaving Caroline standing in the mud of her worthless inheritance, watching the floodwater slowly recede around her boots. She didn't cry. She had stopped crying the day they pulled Thomas's body from the river, bloated and pale and nothing like the man she had married. She had cried at the funeral, cried when they read the will, cried when she realized that the family she had married into considered her a stranger now that their son was gone. But she was done crying. Crying didn't build anything. Crying didn't solve problems. Crying just made the Jessups think they had won. She walked the perimeter of her 40 acres that afternoon, marking the highest points with stakes, noting where the water pooled and where it drained. The land wasn't completely flat. There was a slight rise near the center, maybe 3 feet higher than the surrounding floodplain. It wasn't much, but it was something. She found old Reuben the next morning, sitting on the porch of his shack at the edge of town, watching the river the way old men watch things they've known their whole lives. He was 73 years old and had been a riverman since before the war, running boats up and down the Missouri when it was still wild and unpredictable. The flood of 1844 had killed his wife and 2 children. He had stayed on the river anyway, because leaving would have meant they died for nothing. "I need to know how high the water gets," Caroline said, standing at the bottom of his steps. "Not this year, not an average year, the worst year, the highest it's ever been." Reuben looked at her for a long moment, his eyes the color of river mud. "You're the Jessup widow, the one they gave the bottom 40. I'm Caroline, and yes, that land floods every spring, sometimes twice. I know, I was standing in it yesterday. Reuben was quiet for a while, his gaze drifting back to the river. 1844, he said finally. Water came up 22 feet above normal, covered everything from here to the bluffs, drowned half the county. They found bodies in trees 30 miles downstream. 22 feet. That was the worst. 1881 was 18 feet. 1885 was 16. This year was maybe 12, 13 at the peak. He looked back at her. Why do you want to know? Caroline had been thinking about the answer to that question since she walked her property line. Because if I know how high the water gets, I know how high my house needs to be. Reuben's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. You're going to build on that land. It's the only land I have. Most people would sell it for whatever they could get and move somewhere dry. I'm not most people, and selling would mean the Jessups win. Reuben was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, his joints cracking like dry timber, and walked into his shack. He came back with a piece of paper covered in pencil marks and water stains. I've been watching this river for 50 years, marking the floods, measuring the heights, trying to understand how she thinks. He handed her the paper. This is everything I know about the Missouri. The patterns, the warning signs, the way the water moves through the bottoms. If you're going to build on that land, you're going to need it. Caroline looked at the paper. It was covered in numbers and notes, dates and measurements, the accumulated wisdom of a man who had lost everything to the river and spent his life learning how to survive her. Why are you helping me? Reuben sat back down in his chair. Because I had a daughter once. She would have been about your age if the river hadn't taken her, and because the Jessups have been telling everyone in town that you'll be dead or gone by winter. He smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. I'd like to see them wrong. Stay with me, because the way she built on that flooded land is the reason she was still standing when the worst flood in 40 years washed everything else away. The construction began in June, after the spring floods had fully receded and the ground had dried enough to work. Caroline didn't hire a crew. She couldn't afford one. What she had was a small inheritance from her own father, enough to buy materials but not labor, and a body that had grown up on a farm and knew how to work. The foundation was the key. A normal house sat on stone or brick, anchored to the earth, trusting the ground to stay where it was. But the ground on the bottom 40 didn't stay where it was. It flooded, silted, shifted, and eroded with every high water. A normal foundation would crack within years, undermined by the river's constant rearrangement of the soil. Caroline didn't build a foundation. She built legs. She started by digging 12 holes, each one 4 feet deep, arranged in a grid pattern on the slight rise at the center of her property. Into each hole, she sank a post of white oak, the hardest wood she could find, treated with tar to resist rot. The posts were 12 inches thick and 20 feet long. When she finished setting them, they rose 16 feet above the ground, anchored 4 feet into the clay beneath the topsoil. The neighbors came to watch. Word had spread that the Jessup widow was building something strange on the flooded land, and curiosity drew them like flies to honey. They stood at the edge of her property and stared at the forest of posts rising from the mud, and they laughed. "She's building a dock," one man said. "Maybe she thinks the flood will come back and she can catch fish from her porch." "She's lost her mind," another agreed. "Grief does that to women. Someone should tell the Jessups their daughter-in-law has gone simple." Caroline ignored them. She was too busy lifting beams. The platform came next. She laid heavy joists across the tops of the posts, notching them to fit together, pinning them with wooden pegs she had carved herself. The platform was 16 feet by 24 feet, large enough for a small house, raised 16 feet above the ground. The highest flood on record was 22 feet. She had 4 feet of margin. It would have to be enough. Horace Jessup came by in late July when the platform was finished and Caroline had started framing the walls. He rode his horse to the edge of her property and sat there for a long time, staring at the structure rising above the bottomland like a watchtower. "What in God's name are you building?" he finally called out. Caroline was on the platform, hammering studs into place. She didn't stop working. "A house." "That's not a house. That's a chicken coop on stilts. The first good wind will blow it into the river." "The posts go 4 feet into the clay, Mr. Jessup. The frame is cross-braced with white oak. It's stronger than your barn." "It's ridiculous is what it is. You're wasting good lumber on a folly that will be underwater by April." Caroline finally stopped hammering. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at her father-in-law, 16 feet below. The platform is 16 feet above the ground. The highest flood on record was 22 feet. This house will be dry when the water is over your head. She picked up her hammer again. "But I'm sure you know better, Mr. Jessup. You've been farming this valley for 30 years. You must know exactly how high the water can get." Horace's face went red. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Caroline went back to framing. The house was finished by October. It wasn't large, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid. The walls were thick planking, double-layered against the wind. The roof was steep-pitched to shed rain and debris. The floor was raised platform, and beneath the floor was 16 feet of nothing but air and oak posts. She had built a staircase that ran up the outside of the structure, switchbacking twice before reaching the door. It was the only way in or out. In a flood, the lower portion of the stairs would be underwater, but the upper portion would remain accessible. She could come and go by boat if she needed to. The first winter was hard, but survivable. The house swayed slightly in the strongest winds, a gentle motion that took some getting used to, but the structure held. The elevation actually helped with heating. Heat rises, and in her raised house, the warmth from her small stove accumulated in the loft where she slept instead of bleeding into the frozen ground. She burned less wood than she had expected. The spring flood of 1893 came in late March. It was a moderate year, nothing special, the water rising maybe 10 feet above normal before slowly receding. Caroline watched from her platform as the brown water spread across her 40 acres, covering the ground, lapping at the base of her posts, then slowly draining away. Her house stayed dry. Her stairs stayed accessible above the 8th step. She caught fish from her porch and ate fresh catfish for dinner, while the rest of the valley waited for the waters to recede. The Jessup's farm, a mile upstream on what they had always called high ground, took on 3 feet of water in the lower fields. They lost a season of winter wheat and had to replant in May. They said nothing to Caroline about it, but the spring of 1893 was just a rehearsal. The main performance came in June of 1894. The winter of 1893 to 1894 was brutal across the upper Missouri watershed. Snow piled up in the mountains, more than anyone could remember, drifts that didn't melt until May. When the thaw finally came, it came fast. A week of warm rain on top of the snowpack sent a wall of water down the river system, and by June 1st, the Missouri was rising faster than it had since 1844. Caroline watched the river the way Reuben had taught her to watch it. She noted the color change from brown to gray, the increase in debris, the way the current accelerated even before the water level rose. She saw the warning signs 3 days before the flood peaked. She spent those 3 days preparing. She moved everything valuable to the loft. She stocked a week's worth of food and water. She pulled up the lower section of her staircase and stored it on the platform, leaving only the upper section accessible. If the water came as high as she feared, she would need a boat, not stairs. The flood crested on June 8th, 1894. The water rose 21 feet above normal, the highest since 1844, a catastrophic wall of brown destruction that rewrote the geography of the entire valley. Caroline sat on her porch, 16 feet above the ground, and watched the water climb past her posts. 10 feet, 12 feet, 14 feet. The current was moving fast, carrying entire trees, sections of fence, the bloated bodies of livestock that had been caught in the fields. The sound was immense, a constant roar of moving water that drowned out everything else. At 15 feet, the water reached the base of her platform. Small waves lapped against the underside of her floor, a gentle reminder of how close she was cutting it. But the platform held. The posts held. The cross-bracing held. Her house swayed gently in the current, but it didn't move from its foundation. The water flowed around the posts, not against them. The force distributed across 12 points of contact with the clay below. At 16 feet, the water began to enter the lower portion of the Jessup farmhouse, a mile upstream on what they had always believed was high ground. Caroline learned what happened to the Jessups later, from survivors who had fled to the bluffs before the worst of it hit. The family had stayed in their house too long, believing the flood would crest before it reached them. By the time they realized their mistake, the water was chest deep on the first floor and rising fast. They made it to the second floor, then to the attic, then to the roof. When the roof began to break apart under the pressure of debris slamming into the walls, they were rescued by a boat from town, pulled from the wreckage of their home as it collapsed into the current behind them. They came to Caroline on the second day, after the water had begun to recede, but before it had dropped enough for them to return to their ruined farm. Horace, Delphine, and 2 farmhands who had been trapped with them, all of them wet and exhausted and stripped of everything except the clothes they wore. Caroline was standing on her porch when their rowboat approached, watching them navigate the debris-filled current. She didn't speak as they tied up to one of her posts. She didn't speak as they climbed the rope ladder she had lowered. She didn't speak as they stood dripping on her platform, looking at the dry house she had built on the land they had given her as an insult. Delphine was the first to break the silence. "We need shelter," she said, her voice hoarse from 2 days of screaming and praying. "Just until the water goes down, just until we can find somewhere else." Caroline looked at the woman who had told her she wasn't family, the man who had given her worthless land out of spite, the people who had laughed at her stilts and called her simple and predicted she would be dead or gone by winter. "The house you're looking at was built on the land you gave me because you thought it was worthless," Caroline said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "You gave me the flooded land because you wanted me to fail. You laughed when I built on stilts. You told everyone in town I had lost my mind." Horace's face was gray with exhaustion and something else, something that might have been shame in a man capable of feeling it. "Caroline, please, We made mistakes, but we're family. We're your husband's parents." "My husband is dead," Caroline said. "You made sure to remind me of that every day for 6 months. You told me I wasn't real family. You gave me land you knew would flood." She paused. "But you're right about one thing. Thomas would have wanted me to help you, so come inside. There's room by the stove. We'll talk about the rest when the water goes down." She stepped aside and let them in, all 4 of them, into the house on stilts that had survived when their high ground had failed. She gave them blankets and hot coffee and a place to sleep that wasn't underwater. But she never forgot what they had done. And she never let them forget that the flooded land they had given her was the only reason they were still alive. The flood of 1894 destroyed the Jessup farmhouse completely. The foundation cracked, the walls collapsed, and the current carried most of the lumber downstream. Horace spent the summer salvaging what he could, living in a tent on the bluffs, trying to rebuild what he had lost. He never did manage it. The land that had been in his family for 2 generations was sold at auction in 1895 to pay debts he couldn't cover. Caroline bought 30 acres of it, the good acres, the South 40 that Thomas had promised her, minus the 10 acres she couldn't afford. She paid with money she earned selling fish and crawfish from the bottomland that flooded every spring. The same floods that destroyed normal farms deposited rich silt on her property and filled the low areas with fish that had nowhere to go when the water receded. She harvested them by the barrel, selling them to the hotels in town that couldn't get fresh river fish anywhere else. The Stilt House became a landmark on the river. Steamboat pilots used it as a navigation marker, calling it the Widow's Tower, because it was visible for miles in every direction. Other farmers in the bottoms began building elevated structures of their own, copying her design, raising their barns and their houses above the flood line. Horace Jessup moved to Kansas City after he lost the farm. He died there in 1901, still telling anyone who would listen that the bottom 40 had been worthless and that his daughter-in-law had just gotten lucky with the timing. Delphine followed him 2 years later, never having apologized, never having acknowledged that the land they had given away in spite had been worth more than the land they had kept. Caroline lived in her stilt house until 1932, through 6 more major floods and countless minor ones. She never lost a night's sleep to rising water. She expanded the original structure twice, adding a second building connected to the first by a covered walkway, then a third that served as a smokehouse for the fish she caught. By the time she passed at 72, her 40 acres of worthless bottomland was producing more income per acre than any farm in the county. Her grandson still owns the property. The original stilt house was replaced in 1945, but the new one follows the same design, raised 16 feet above the ground on white oak posts, surviving floods that have destroyed newer houses built by people who thought they knew better than a widow with nothing to lose. The Historical Society has a photograph of Caroline taken in 1920, standing on the porch of her stilt house with the river visible in the background. She is 50 years old in the picture, her auburn hair gone gray, her face weathered by decades of river living. She is smiling, a small, private expression that doesn't need to explain itself. The caption reads, "Caroline Jessup on the porch of the elevated home she built in 1892, on land her in-laws considered worthless." It doesn't mention that those same in-laws had come to her door during the worst flood in 40 years, begging for shelter in the house they had mocked. It doesn't mention that she let them in anyway, because that was the kind of woman she was. It doesn't mention that she bought their farm at auction a year later, and lived on it for the rest of her life. Some stories end with reconciliation and forgiveness. This one ends with a woman standing dry on a porch 16 feet above a flood, watching the current carry away everything that belonged to the people who had tried to destroy her. If this story of rising above resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of forgotten triumph. What is the flooded land in your own life that everyone else thinks is worthless? And what would happen if you found a way to build above it?